And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been a teacher at the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. And I've been a member here at the Zen Center for about 15 years now. Zen is just one of a number of different schools in Buddhism, but it's probably the most stripped down school in the sense that there's not a whole lot of dogma or belief associated with it. In Zen Buddhism, the emphasis is on what you experience in the present moment, and there aren't a set of beliefs that you need to agree to or sign up to. And the experiential nature of it, the fact that it's relying on what you experience in the world, how you interpret it, and then compare that to what others are learning and thinking about, that's in a way very similar, I think, to science. The goal is to relieve the suffering of ourselves and others. Buddha said, I teach suffering and the relief from suffering. And so it doesn't have this endpoint of heaven or hell or something like that. It's much more grounded in the present moment and is more, you might say, pragmatic.
Well, good morning and welcome to The Well. If you haven't had a chance to meet me, my name is Danny. I am one of our pastors here. Excited, glad you're in worship with us today, especially as Rod said, if it's your first time, it takes a lot of courage to come and try any church, especially a new church. Honored that you would do that. And as the screen says, we're in our sermon series, A Bigger Table. We're talking about different religions. And someone came up to me before the first service and they said, my mom wants to know why we're not talking about Jesus. Like, why are you guys talking about other religions on Sunday? And I was like, that's a great question. And so I wanted to give an answer to this, which I've given a little bit every week to some degree. The reason we're having this conversation is a couplefold. One, because I firmly think Jesus would. I think Jesus would spend time talking about who gets a seat at the table. He would talk about what it looks like to sit at that table from a different perspective. He would talk about how do we create more seats, not how do we take them away. And so I think that's certainly an important part of this. One thing I'm not trying to do is make you any less Christian. I actually hope that you are more interested in following Jesus if that is where you find yourself through this. And in today's conversation specifically, I think there's a lot Christians can learn about spirituality through the practices of Buddhism. And that doesn't mean that you sacrifice your Christian practices, your belief in Jesus, but I think there's a lot that we can learn. One of my favorite books I read in undergraduate time was about a Catholic priest who said he studied Buddhism and it made his Catholic faith even stronger. And so I think that it can be really, really powerful. And so also, we're not trying to make this a sermon about apologetics. And if you don't know what apologetics are, this is not a sermon series about how can I tell people why they're wrong, what is the art of arguing and influencing people. It's not about that. This is about pluralism in the sense of holding deeply with convictions what you believe and not thinking surrendering compassion in that process has to be a part of the journey. And so we're going to explore Buddhism today. I'm excited. Who you saw in the video was a friend of mine named Randy. We were in a faith and science cohort fellowship together for about 2 years in New York City. He lives in Minneapolis. We had about a 45-minute conversation on the Deconstruction Zone podcast, which is our church's podcast that Maggie and I host. And we talked about his experience with Buddhism. It is having some issues getting on Spotify right now, but you can find it on YouTube. And so if you want to go check it, it's a great conversation just about Buddhism. He goes into a lot of different things. And like he said, he's a practitioner, so he practices Buddhism, but he's also a teacher in his community as well. He's not like a cleric or religious leader necessarily, but he gets to teach and is kind of a lay teacher within his community. So, but I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that conversation. But if you joined us at the Drip, which was our midweek service we do on Thursday nights, we're going to be kicking it back off in September after Labor Day. But one of the things we did, we were talking about world religions in that before this series started, and we use this analogy, I don't know if you've heard it before, of different religions are different paths up the same mountain. Have you ever heard that analogy? We're all going up the same mountain. And I think for many of us, we hear that and that's really good. I dig that. That means we're all walking together, all going up. And we actually wanted to challenge that visual for all of us because it makes a couple of assumptions. One, that we all have the same summit, that we're going the same place, that there are the same questions being asked, the same problems being solved. And at the core, That's just not true. Like Christians and Muslims and our Jewish siblings, Hindus, Buddhists, New Age, indigenous, like there are different levels of questions being asked, journeys up the mountain, and what the summit looks like. And so certainly we're all journeying towards wholeness, might be a way to look at it, like journeying towards finding something. But the reason that that analogy might be incomplete is it assumes we all are asking the same questions and all are trying to address the same problems. And so what I wanted to do, and we said this last week with Islam, like I wanted to explore Islam on its own terms. I want to explore Buddhism in its own terms as well. Like what are the problems? What is the summit? What is the solution? And then ultimately, where is Christianity and Buddhism similar, if at all? And what can Christians learn from Buddhist practices? So with that in mind, I want to give you kind of the questions I think that we're asking. So Christians, I would say, are generally asking this question. They're saying, how do I relate to God? Like Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Like how do I relate? Another way to phrase it is like a personal relationship. If you've been in kind of evangelical spaces, you've heard this personal relationship with God. That's generally the Christian question. Like certainly we're trying to address sin and brokenness, but by way of a relationship with our Creator and our God. Judaism is asking like, well, how do I live in faithful covenant with God? If you read the Old Testament, it's a lot about covenant language, like connection and promise, God's promise to us and our promise back to God. And so the Jewish question is like, how do I remain in covenant with God? Last week in Islam, we explored their core question was like, how do I submit myself to God? It's like submission and loyalty is a big tenet of the Islamic faith. And so submission and loyalty is huge. And I would contend that Buddhism asks, and Randy said this a little bit in the video, why do human beings suffer and how do we become free from suffering? That is the core question of the Buddhist faith. And someone came up to me afterwards, after the first of it, said like, what I love about Buddhism is less of like a religion and more of a philosophy. I think that could certainly be true in some ways, but it certainly still is a religious perspective and there are theological implications. And so I would be careful not to just reduce it to like a philosophical agreement or framework. It really is a religion of its own. And they're asking again, like, why do human beings suffer and how do we become free from that? And I would say that Buddhism, I think, can teach us something really quite powerful and profound. It can teach us that suffering comes from our attachment to things, specifically our attachment to control. And Jesus invites Christians into a similar challenge that I think Buddhists are invited into, which is to trust, to be present, and to surrender. And I think Christians and Buddhism, while we arrive at different conclusions, Buddhists can offer Christians a set of practices that can cultivate spiritual depth and awakening. Awakening is like a scary word for some Christians. Like they're like, oh my gosh, that sounds scary. Buddhists would use like enlightenment. Christians use this word. They would call it sanctification. This is like an awakening, an awareness of sin and brokenness and goodness in the world. Like that is ultimately what sanctification in the theological lens is a level of awakening, or if you're using Buddhist terms, enlightenment, like a level of awareness spiritually of the self, of what's going on around you and your presence in the world. So what I wanted, you guys know that I like flowcharts and stuff. So I wanted to give like another one of these things to just talk to you about like how this is all develops. So this is small. I get that, and I apologize in advance. But take a picture. Stand up while I'm talking. Like, come right here. Take a picture. It doesn't bother me. I've never been distracted once in my life. And so, we see, I don't think that was the joke. So we see that on this side, and we explored this last week, everything over here. I'm just going to revisit this really quick. So we have Abrahamic faiths. These are called Abrahamic faiths because they come through the line of a guy named Abraham. We read about him in Genesis. Abraham has two different wives, or two different mothers of his children, Sarah and Hagar. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, who is the kind of creator of Islam, or the kind of the way in which Islam comes through. And then Sarah, through her comes Isaac, which then comes Judaism. Through Judaism comes Christianity. There are dates with all of these. These are not super significant to anything I'm talking about today, but if you want to see like the development of things over time, you can come and check these out. But what's interesting is like around 2000 BCE is when Abraham, we would say, I mean, that's like the a mythology of it and the timeline of it. But around 1500 BCE is when Hinduism and kind of these different Eastern religions start to come to be. So really not long after the Abrahamic faith start to like get their traditions going. There's other Eastern religions like Hinduism, which kind of precedes Buddhism. We're not going to talk about Hinduism today, but helpful to understand that this is still kind of a path that is developing. If you want to learn more about Hinduism, there's a lot to be learned about it, and it's not exactly Buddhism. And so just don't hear me conflating these into one thing necessarily. But we see Buddhism get started with a guy named Siddhartha Gautama in around 563 to 483 BCE. This guy, you're like, I've never heard this name before. You do know this person. They have become affectionately referred to as the Buddha, is who this person is. And so to give you a little bit of information, he was born around the 5th century BCE, raised as a prince, generally pretty privileged, generally pretty insulated from pain, suffering, brokenness, really sheltered. It's like privilege would be maybe what we would use in 2026 to talk about this. Sheltered would be like the mythology and the lore around it. He was just sheltered from poverty, from suffering, from brokenness, from a lot of things. And during the course of his life, he eventually encountered some of these things: sickness, old age, death. And in the midst of all of this, he encounters a wandering holy man who invites him to leave his wealth and his privilege in search of greater spiritual questions and ultimately greater spiritual answers. And years later, after meditation and searching, he experiences what we now call, or he would call, enlightenment. And this is when he then transitions to being known as the Buddha or the awakened one. And so it kind of becomes the core of this. And from there, we see that there are some different camps of Buddhism that fall beneath this. I don't want to hammer these a ton, but in the same way that Christian denominations are interesting, this stuff is interesting to me too, because it's not a monolith. Sometimes we're like, oh, Christians are all Christians. And if you've been a part of the Christian world for a while, you're like, but we're not, right? And Buddhism's kind of the same way, right? There's some differing dividing lines that come in this. And so Theravada Buddhism is the oldest surviving tradition, kind of built around personal enlightenment, found in Southeast Asia. And so that would be this one, kind of the oldest one. Going down a little bit a little bit newer than that is Mahayana Buddhism, which is the largest branch. This is where you would find Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is the most popular, at least in America. If you know a Buddhist, you probably know a Zen Buddhist. Randy is a Zen Buddhist, so his temple is a Zen temple. And so you likely know a Zen Buddhist. Largest branch, they care about compassion, and they care about the liberation of all things, human things and experience. And liberation being from suffering. Again, what is the main question? Why is suffering here? And more than that, how do we avoid and eradicate it, more or less? And so Mahayana would be in this. And then Vajrayana is kind of Tibetan Buddhism. It's built around rituals, meditation, far more mystic in kind of its ideas. And so again, why I put this on here is important. Because, and I forgot my pen 2 services in a row. So we see that these are not connected, right? There is no hard line. There is no dotted line. These are different family trees. Okay, and so in the same way, there's a line down here from Islam and Judaism and Christianity over here, there's some stark differences between Islam and Christianity, Islam and Judaism, but they're on the same tree. They come from Abraham. They share stories. I talked about this last week. Islam views Jesus as a great prophet. Even if not the Messiah, they still value him. Even Jews would say Jesus existed. Not really sure that he's super, super important, but he was around. There is no connection here between these, right? This is a different family tree, comes down, and it's a different thing, right? So this is not connected in the same way. It's its own tree. Does that make sense? I just want to make sure that you're not going to eventually come from here and be and it goes like this. Because that's not what happens. And it doesn't go like this. They're their own. Does that make sense? I just want to make sure. No one comes out here and is Danny says we're all in the same family tree. Okay? All right. They come from, and I'm not saying that in that's not a value statement. Hear that as well. This is just the best way we can add value is by honoring origins and understanding where things come from. And we try to conflate these things, especially in pluralistic and interreligious conversations. Sometimes we're just well, I speak Christianese. And so the best way is to shove Buddhism into my Christian beliefs. or I'm Abrahamic, and so they must have like a patriarch. And they kind of do with Siddhartha, but it's different in the way that this comes out. So I just want to throw that out there. But Buddhism doesn't fit within the family tree of kind of Abrahamic faith. It's its own thing over here. But there are some similarities between Buddhism and Abrahamic beliefs and Christianity, some that I want to explore. Both Christianity and Buddhism, and I would actually say all Abrahamic beliefs, believe suffering exists and take it seriously. Now, there are some different conclusions around how suffering came to be and how we eradicate that, but I would contend, like if I'm being generous to all my Christian siblings, we all take suffering pretty seriously. And so that would be kind of a similar. We both believe transformation is possible. Now, that transformation looks different. For Buddhists, that's enlightenment, right? Like I'm going to become enlightened to my awareness of suffering, brokenness. How do I navigate that? How do I stop making it happen? How do I prevent it? How do I mitigate it? All of those things. For Christians, again, like in the Wesleyan tradition, we're United Methodist Church, we believe in something called sanctification, which is becoming kind of purified in our beliefs and our actions. Like some would say you can become perfect in this life. I'm not sure that's I've not met someone that's figured that out yet. But I would say that sanctification says that we can become so aware of sin and brokenness in our world that it's like walking into a house with different rooms, and I can walk in and I can be like, oh, I turn the lights on, I see the room with full clarity. Like that would be sanctification. Turns the lights on in every room so we're more aware of the rooms we're walking into. A little bit of enlightenment in that. Both encourage compassion towards others. Both call followers towards self-examination. Self-examination is huge within Buddhism, and it should be huge within Christianity. Not always. Sometimes we're told not to trust our thoughts, which is not actually in the Bible. But we can find this somewhere, right? But both should call towards self-examination, and then both kind of warn against greed and selfishness. Buddhism in a really, really big way, in the sense that it's trying to detach ourselves from the need for finances, or the need for greed. But I was talking to someone after service, like some of the same pitfalls of like financial manipulation and manipulation of all kinds, misogyny, things like can still exist in Buddhism. After the last service, I was very generous to Buddhism, and someone came up to me who was a part of the Buddhist community, like, just so you know, we mess up too sometimes, right? And that's just helpful to know, right? Like that there can still be financial manipulation, there can still be gender manipulation, there can still be negative things that happen, but generally both warn against greed and selfishness, even if they're imperfect in their application of the practice of avoiding those things. So here's what I would say, though, kind of naming the differences in this. Christianity centers on a relationship with God, while Buddhism centers on personal awakening. Now, I would contend a personal relationship with God should ultimately spiritually awaken us and personally awaken us. But if you're in a church, the challenge is often, how do I center my relationship with my Creator? How do I center my relationship with Jesus? In Buddhism, it is very personal in terms of finding a way to be personally awakened or enlightened to your place in the world, your attachments in this world, the suffering of this world, so ultimately you can navigate that and really ultimately eradicate it. Like I think a hope of Buddhism would be if everyone is awakened, we would live in a world free of suffering. I think that would be kind of a presupposition, at least, that like if we were all here, then we wouldn't have suffering. And I think Christians would maybe contend the same thing. If we all had a really holistic relationship with God and were awakened to the implication that the world would be more whole and have less suffering in it. But Christians often ask, who is God in the midst of suffering? Who is God in the midst of goodness? Who is God in relation to me? Who is, we have the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Like, who is God in this triune creation? Like, who is God is a core question that Christians often ask. Buddhists are just less concerned with the God question, and they're like, why do we suffer? They're like, that's an interesting question. I'm glad you're exploring the who question. I want to know the why. Like, why do we suffer? And really more than the why, how do we stop it? Is a question that Buddhists are often answering. Both questions, I think, are important. But this kind of leads us to what I think would be the most famous thing with famous teachings within the Buddhist teachings, which is the Eightfold Path. Has anyone heard of the Eightfold Path? Okay, so a few of you. Before we get there, there are 4 guiding truths that undergird Buddhism. And so I'll get to the Eightfold Path in a second, but they're what they would call 4 noble truths that kind of undergird all of it, which is suffering exists, Suffering has causes. Freedom is possible, and there is a path out of this. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, we agree suffering exists. But this is interesting because for Buddhists, they would be like, we're naming this right off the bat. Like what you do first often matters. It signals something. So to lead with suffering exists is important. Right? To be like, suffering is real. Let's not pretend like it's not. It exists. Also, it has causes. Usually us. And usually the brokenness of this world, it's like not just random. It's not like cosmically happening to us, which is something that depending on your spiritual beliefs, you might be just like, well, chaos happens, sin happens, so it's there. Buddhists would say, like, there are causes to suffering, and we are often the reason of that. It's not random or divorced from action. It happens because of unenlightened people, might be what Buddhists would say. Freedom, though, is possible. Love this one. Like, you don't have to, like, things don't have to be broken forever. Like, it doesn't have to stay this way. Things can get better, and there's a path. And this is what leads us to this eightfold path. And Randy talks a little bit about this in the podcast. He does a really great job diving into this. He divides it up rather into what he calls chapters, and that was helpful for me to like break it down because 8 of them. That's a lot to remember. I'm not a very smart guy, and so to remember 8 things is really hard for me. But to break it up into chunks is a little bit easier for me to digest, and so this might be helpful for you as you parse these out into their chapters. And the first chapter is wisdom, and I love this because this is personal to you and to me. Like to find enlightenment is to begin with wisdom. Because wisdom undergirds action, it undergirds intentions, it's important. And so wisdom is essential. And wisdom is broken up into 2 parts of this eightfold path, right view and right intention. And this is interesting for me because right view is saying that we are challenged to see reality for what it is. Not what we wish it was, not what we hope it is, not what it could be, but what do we really see in front of us? Like, and use injustice and brokenness around us. Like looking around and saying, like, I don't want injustice to exist. I don't want brokenness to exist, but I see systems of injustice and brokenness in front of me. That would be right view. Like seeing things with honesty and objectivity and really calling them out. And I think Jesus talks about this as well. Like throughout the gospel, I think Jesus talks about orienting ourselves to the right view of truth is what Jesus would use. And he talks about this in John's gospel, John 8:31 and 32. He says, you are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. This feels to me very much like a right view statement. Like if you can align yourself to the truth, to seeing things for what they are, that truth will begin to set you free. And then the path, though, moves within the wisdom from right view to right intention. And this, I think, is an important shift that sometimes I think Christians miss, if I'm being critical of our own group here. I think sometimes we miss this. Right view is important, seeing things for what they are, but the eightfold path says you got to examine your motivations. What's driving you? Is it fear? Is it status? Is it control? Is it love? Is it broken? Like, what is driving you? And the eightfold path of Buddhism says that nothing is divorced of motives. There are always intentions. And sometimes those are pure intentions. Sometimes those are negative intentions. Sometimes those are malicious intentions. Sometimes they're confused intentions. But intentions are real. And Jesus again talks about this as well throughout the Gospels. In Matthew 6:21, he says, where your treasure is, your heart will be there too. This is like a intentions statement. Oftentimes we use this in terms of a like generosity conversation, like where you put your money, that's where your heart is. You could certainly use it for that. But really what it's trying to say is like where your heart is proves what you care about, what your intentions are. So if you're putting your heart and your treasure into fighting injustice, that's where you're going to be. If you're going to put it into propping it up, like that's where it's going to be. Like intentions matter. And for the eightfold path, in the first set of this, the first kind of chapter is wisdom, which is the right view, seeing things kind of as they are, and then also right intention, like what are the motivations that are driving my actions. But what I love is that it moves from wisdom. It's not just a thought experiment. And sometimes like all religions, not all, sometimes religions can be, or philosophy can just be thought experiments. Let's just think about this thing all the time. What I love about this eightfold path is it moves directly into its biggest chunk of these, which is ethical living, which is kind of the second chapter. It's not just about let me think about all these things that my stuff, but it should have ethical implications for the world around us. And those are divided into three, which are right speech, right action, right livelihood. And I'll talk about each of these for a second. Like right speech, it seems pretty obvious, right? Like your words matter. The things you say matter. Like you shouldn't be flippant. You shouldn't be cutting. You shouldn't be hurtful. Like your words have impact. And I can be like, I can be the worst at this. In our Enneagram series, we talked about, I'm an Enneagram 8, and so I'm like, truth matters. So I'm just going to say it, and you're going to deal with it, right? Like that certainly could be true, that I think that, but my words matter, and they have impacts on people, right? And so just because something can be true, the way we speak it, Buddhism would contend, matters. Like our words really, really matter. And Proverbs, so pre-Jesus, talks about this. In Proverbs 12:18, it says, the words of the reckless pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. This is a statement of saying, like, right speech matters. Like, you have to be concerned with what you're putting out into the world. What are you saying, and how is that building people up, or how is that tearing people down? But then it moves from like, all right, your words matter, take inventory of that, speak with intention, but then also your actions matter. Like right action matters. And so that it means a couple of things. One, your actions ought to be congruent with your words. That's probably assumed in that, right? If you're saying one thing and then your actions are doing something else, you got to take an inventory of that. But it's trying to say like your actions should be compassionate. They should be making the world better. And again, what is the core question of Buddhism? Why does suffering exist, and how do we eradicate it? So your actions should always be moving towards the eradication of suffering, both for yourself and for other people. And we see this lived out in Jesus' words too, right? The Good Samaritan is not a story about people agreeing with one another, being culturally connected, being yoked to one another out of some obligation. The only part of that story is about two people that are culturally disconnected, religiously disconnected. And again, maybe you know the story, maybe you don't. Like Pharisee and priest and the Levite walk by, and their words are right, probably. Like, we should care for the marginalized. We should care for the poor. We should care for the people beat up on the side of the road. But their actions are like, but I got stuff to do, so I'm going to book it right past him. And then the Samaritan man probably hangs out with all of his friends, and he's like talking about like, man, we should make the world a more just place, do all these things. And then he sees someone hurting. He's like, all right, my actions are going to follow my words here. I'm going to go help this person. So it doesn't say anything about like liking each other. It doesn't say anything about like getting a beer later. But their actions matter. And in the Eightfold Path, right speech matters, but right speech should be connected to right action. And then the last one is right livelihood. This one was the most interesting to me because it connects to like what we do with our lives. And more or less the best way that I could like project this is like you shouldn't be benefiting in a way that is causing more suffering for other people. Like I remove suffering for me. Like I'm wealthy now, and I'm insulated, and I live on a compound with 5 fences that no one can get through, and I don't suffer anymore, right? But then everyone outside of my walls are poor and broken and starving and suffering. Well, that's not enlightenment. That's not healing. That's not holy. That's division and more suffering, right? And actually, in many ways, like my livelihood could be creating more suffering inadvertently for other people as I am more free from it. And so it's really trying to assert that my lack of suffering in my livelihood, in the way that I've arranged my life, still has to be connected to my speech and my actions, and then all together, talk about a Trinitarian view, right? A three-piece thing. Like they should be working in tandem together to eradicate suffering. Actions, intention, and livelihood. And Buddha would argue that really you couldn't eradicate suffering if one of those three aren't in line with together. And really connecting that to intention and view as well. But then the last one, so that we have wisdom, we have ethical living, and then the last chapter is spiritual formation. And I love this because it's not just a thought experiment. It's not just like a charity project, but it's a formation journey. Like there is continual formation that's happening within people that are following the Buddhist Eightfold Path, which is really cool because it's not like a race in a marathon to cross the finish line, but it's about continually being formed. And I think Christians are like, man, if I just sprint full force into this thing, I can cross the finish line and I'll be done. Or like, I'm going to pray the prayer. I'm going to invite Jesus into my heart. I'm going to check my auto give button, so I give what I need to give to like check that box, and I'll like check into a group or whatever. It's like I check my boxes. This formation is like not box checking. It's like ongoing. And the best way that I could think about this is like when I set like a reminder on my iPhone, and it's like I use the daily reminders. The moment I click the button, it disappears, and then it immediately pops back up to remind me to do it tomorrow. Like formation is a continual revisiting, not something that's like set it and forget it or check it once and you never see it again. It's a perpetual process. And this is lived out in three different ways: right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And so right effort is saying that the practice that we do matter, and the practices, the things that we practice begin to shape us. So prayer, generosity, forgiveness, community, those things really matter. And really we see those things kind of projected in all religions: Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, New Age, indigenous Christianity, or indigenous spirituality, which we'll explore next week. Like we see right effort mattering. Now sometimes people would split hairs on what the effort ought to be, but saying that like the place we put our effort matters. And for Christianity and Buddhism, it would be in prayer, generosity, forgiveness, community, and ultimately like trying to like eradicate suffering for Buddhists. Right mindfulness is number two. This is perhaps what I think is the greatest gift that Buddhists could give to Christians. If we became more mindful, I think it would open the floodgates of spirituality for a lot of people. Like I am not a super mindful person. I think you guys probably all are. But it's something I have to work on all the time. And I think Christians can sometimes miss being mindful. And Jesus does talk about this as well. So I wanted to revisit a scripture that Jesus gives in one of his teachings and then connect it back to Buddhism. But in Matthew 6:25 through 27, he talks about something I think connects to this level of mindfulness. He says, "Therefore I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about what your body or what you'll wear. Isn't life more than food, and the body and more than clothes?" And then he goes on to say, "Look at the birds in the sky. They don't sow seed or harvest grain or gather crops into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you worth much more than they are? Who among you, by worrying, can add a single moment to their life?" This isn't saying like just stop worrying, though it kind of maybe sounds like that. But I don't know that it's saying like just don't worry about things. But what it's trying to say is like, how can you be mindful of the things that matter? Like that God's presence and provision is around you. And I think sometimes I read this and like we're worrying about the wrong things oftentimes. Like we're spending our time being mindful where our mind is, and again, our treasure is, our mind is, our heart's going to be there, right? Like if our mind is caught up in worrying, we can't really be mindful to our own life. We can't really be mindful to the suffering of others, even really our own. Like there is a level of mindfulness that Jesus is challenging his followers to, and this is one of the cores of Buddhism. Like you can't really do any of these other things on this path if you are not mindful. I know it comes as number 7 of the 8, but really, and these aren't like in descending order of importance, but you really can't do many of these if you're not mindful, would be my kind of critique. Like you have to be hyper mindful to be able to see these things, and to be a devout, deeply devoted follower of Jesus. I think mindfulness is a deeply important part of what that journey looks like. And then the last one is right concentration. Think of this in terms of like spiritual practices here. A deep attention, a stillness, and a focus that comes. And I think many Christians are good at like consuming spiritual content. Like we're good at like showing up places, and we're good at absorbing it more or less. But the question that I think this eightfold path ends with and focus on is like, how are we concentrating on those things? How are we resting with those things? How are we letting those things form us in a way that sits with us more than just a moment of teachings? And the root problem, again, of Buddhism, slightly different than Christianity. So I'll revisit that just for a second. Like, it's clinging to things, it's trying to control things, it's trying to possess things, trying to keep things from changing. The way they might word that is attachment. Like, attachment is one of the biggest problems that comes towards suffering. Is like we can attach ourselves to things. And can't Christians do that? Like, I mean, we're like the LeBron James of that. Like, we're sometimes like the GOAT of attaching our things to things we ought not attach ourselves to. And I think if we were challenging ourselves to learn something as followers of Jesus from the way of Buddha, it might be like, how do we become less attached people? How do we become more free people? How do we become people that create a world that becomes less influenced by suffering and more influenced by liberation? And I think the first thing that we do is we have to understand that we are more attached than we think we are. Like, I don't think we think of ourselves as very attached people. And why is that? I think that's because, like, in America, it's the land of the free, right? Like, and we are free to do what we want in X, Y, and Z thing, right? But we're attached. We're attached to our ideas and our beliefs. I was just talking to someone after the first service, and, like, I loved everything you just said about Buddhism, but if I tell any of my friends that this could influence my view of Jesus, they're going to call me blah, 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 right? We're attached to the way people think about us. We're attached to the things that we've been told we have to believe, right? And some of those are good, some of those are bad, but I think we are more attached than we often want to admit we are. And I think if we're going to move into being deeply devoted followers of Jesus, Buddha can teach you that. Like, attachment is one of the greatest things that hinders you from surrender. It's one of the greatest things that hinders you from following. It's one of the greatest things that hinders us from, as Buddha would call it, enlightenment, as Jesus would call it, transformation. But I think releasing our attachment is deeply important. Attachment from control or certainty or ego or status or outcomes. Jesus continually invites his followers into that, to be less attached people. But the second thing is, I think, is it points to spiritual growth requires practice. Again, it's not just a set it and forget it, of check the box once. It is a continual journey. And I think Christians aren't always great at that. I think that Western folks aren't always great at that, because Western thinking is pretty, like, linear. It's pretty, or if it's not linear, it's up and to the right. Eastern is a little more like free and loose. You can be like not choose your own adventure necessarily, but like the path can wander, and the journey is just as important as the end goal. And I think sometimes Western world thinks of the end goal, and Christianity is very influenced by Western thinking. And an Eastern lens would say, like, the journey is just as important as the finish line. And so how do we view the practice of spiritual growth important and something that we commit to practicing? That would actually, if we just committed to that, like, pray a little bit more, be a little bit more intentional, think about your words, think about your actions, your alignment, all of those things. Like, if we practice that and we're intentional about that, it would drastically influence the presence you felt of Jesus in your life and the implications of that belief in the life around you. It's something that we have to practice. And then I would say presence is holy. That is the last thing I think that Buddhism, not the last thing, I'm sure there are more things, but the last thing that I would say that Buddhism might be able to teach us is that being present is really holy. Like, the kingdom of heaven, Jesus did not just talk about as a someday or a not yet or a once down the road. He often said the kingdom of heaven is here and now. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Like, he used here and now in tangible and close language, and he continually encouraged people to be present enough to realize that and to witness it and to bring the forthcoming of it. But people were always fixated on the not yet and the not yet here, the tomorrow and the someday and the what if. And Jesus continually says, like, one of the most holy things you can do is be deeply present here and now and today. And I think about this, like, in terms of Christians' eschatology, which is their view of the afterlife. Like, what happens when we die? Christians are pretty not present generally in their view of the afterlife. They're like, well, I just want to get to heaven, and so because of that, justice for the environment doesn't matter, because it's all going to get blown up someday anyway, right? Or like, well, I know racism sucks, but it's like, God's going to fix it all in heaven, right? Or I know, like, the way men treat women and misogyny, like, that's not great, but, like, in heaven, there's no Jew or Greek or male or female, so it's all going to be right. Like, that's bad theology. That's just not good. Like, presence matters. And, like, being people that influence good and live the way of Jesus and bring heaven on earth here and now matters. And so the challenge that Jesus offers us is to be present and believe that heaven, in the kingdom of heaven, Jesus used the word shalom. You can talk about heaven the way we think about it, but shalom, peace and wholeness, was an act of deep presence here and now that brought the unfolding of that. And the question is, how can we be a part of that? And so here's how I would challenge us to maybe be a part of that and how we can bring the unfolding of that. Slow down. Like, don't rush. We, like, sprint through life. You don't have to. I don't know who told you had to, but you don't have to. Slow down. Take your time. Take a breath. Breathe in the air. See the things around you. Absorb God's creation. Absorb the brokenness. absorb the suffering, absorb the goodness, but slow down enough to do the second thing, which is to pay attention. Like sometimes we're going so fast we can't pay attention, but I know I've been guilty of slowing down and walking so slow, but still be like, but I don't have the bandwidth to pay attention right now. And certainly if that's an act of self-care, do that. But slow down enough to pay attention, to see the things that are going around. And then I would challenge you to loosen your grip on the thing. This is an attachment challenge. Loosen your grip on the things you hold. And here is something that I would say, like at the end of service, I challenge you guys to pray like this often, like, hey, put your hands out in a posture of receiving. I don't do that just because it's like cool or like feel. This is like it's a posture of openness and reception and to receive. Or when I tell you to come forward and put your hands out in front of you as a sign of receiving and not to like grab the bread, it's to with open hands loosen our grip on trying to take everything for ourselves. And as we slow down, as we pay attention, I think as we loosen our grip, it allows us to do the final thing, which is to trust God more. And I don't think that means having more answers. And I don't think that means having all the certainty. But I think it means being more awakened to the presence of God here and now, to who Jesus is and what he offers. And so my hope and my challenge is that, like the Catholic priests I referenced, that the practices of Buddhism could draw you closer to Jesus and not scare you away from him. That they might be things that can draw you deeper into the truth. And I said this to our last service. AA has 12 steps. I don't know if anyone's familiar with AA, been a part of it, or has family members that are. But I become like very connected to the things that are happening in AA and getting a chance to know. And like maybe you don't know this, like the 12 steps of AA are generally like 12 steps of like discipleship. Like a lot of churches just like rephrase them into like how do you become closer to knowing who God is. And it's also like not a strictly Christian organization. But I know Christians who have gone into this journey and like, hey, here are 12 steps that are secular that drive me closer to my Creator, to my God, and to relationship. If you're a Christian in this room, a deeply devoted follower of Jesus, like you can see these 8-fold steps as a way to draw you closer to Jesus. Not something that pushes you away, not something that should be something that is detrimental to your faith, but something that draws you closer to a God that longs to be in a relationship with you, that gives you awareness and presence of what's going on, the suffering of this world, and the way to combat that with the shalom that God offers. And so my hope would be that as we dive into exploring these, that it might draw you closer to Jesus.